How are media organizations changing the way they present issues, stories, and information to counter disinformation and growing polarization, while at the same time encouraging more community involvement? Hello, and welcome to this Mediadelcom podcast with me, Tanya Sakzewski, a journalist and Media Diversity Institute Global Communications Manager. In this episode, I'll be exploring what's happening in Colorado in the United States, where a deliberative communications project is reaching out to its local community. I'll be speaking to two people, Martin Carcasson, who's the director of the Center for Public Deliberation at Colorado State University, and Eric Larsen, the editor of the Coloradoan newspaper, which is part of the project and has adopted deliberative journalism. First, I want to find out from Martin Carcasson what his center, the CPD, which was set up about 17 years ago, has been doing.
I'm a communication studies professor. I have focused for the last 20 years now on how do we talk about tough issues? How do we have the conversations that we need to have across perspectives for democracy to work? Initially, I focused more on national politics, and I grew pretty frustrated with the problematic conversations that, particularly in the United States, a two-party system kind of sparks. So I switched my work when I got to CSU from national to local, and built the CPD as this kind of local resource to help people have these conversations. So what I do with the CPD is through dedicated courses, I train primarily undergraduate students as facilitators. And then we actually design and run events for the city and the school district and community organizations. And, so 100 people show up to talk about an issue. Instead of 100 people just listening to experts on the stage or walking up to a microphone one at a time, we can split them up into 15 different tables with one of my students at each, with a specifically designed process to help them have this tough conversation, to dig into the nuance, to struggle through some of the tensions, and hopefully to tap into kind of human creativity to solve the problems better, instead of just assuming kind of, the problem is the other side kind of thing, right? So we've been doing that work, I think, rather successfully for about 16 years. And what happened with my own work is I started thinking more broadly. I was happy with the events that we were running, but we're thinking more broadly about, basically I use the term deliberative system, or the information ecosystem in Northern Colorado. And how can we influence broader conversations, not just the people that show up to our meetings, right? So we always had a good relationship with the Coloradoan, with the local newspaper, which is certainly part of that. And I started kind of exploring more and more, the role of journalism and democracy in those connections, because there were so many connections to the work that I do with that. And part of it, the Coloradoan actually stopped their opinion page maybe about 5 or 6 years ago for a variety of reasons, not getting enough clicks and takes a lot of work and so forth. So that actually kind of pushed me. I went to this conference by the American Press Institute about the future of editorial journalism, try to understand that. And then API ended up having a grant for innovation that the Coloradoan and I went into, which sparked this Northern Colorado Deliberative Journalism Project. And essentially what that is taking some of the concepts that I know from my work as a facilitator, as a process designer, designing these live synchronous events, the training I give my students on how to intervene in a conversation to help people have a deeper, more effective conversation to work through these tough issues. How can we translate that to journalism? Right. So it's kind of an ongoing experiment. We started in the fall of 21. So we're a little bit over a year in of just kind of experimenting on how to do that. And really, in some ways, I think we've done two big things so far. One is we've actually hopefully sparked a really deep conversation about local journalism. So we've deliberated about journalism in a lot of ways. And then we're also trying to kind of innovate on this idea of deliberative journalism. How is that different than other journalism? How do we kind of build up the skills for journalists to also have that as part of their skill set to help their local community?
With both the events and the journalism angles, what difference is deliberative communications or journalism making to these issues, to the conversation? Are you actually seeing a difference, a result?
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to think so. A lot of my work is connected to like brain science and social psychology, and unfortunately, our brains are much more wired for polarization than they are for deliberation. And then, again, at least our political system here in the United States, being a two-party system, triggers that, right? And it makes it, there's a red team and a blue team, and our brain loves that. Our brains love simple stories, and we love, a narrative with a hero and a victim and a villain. And once we decide who's playing each role, our brain sees what we want. So much of our public discourse out there about difficult issues is rather simplistic, right? And people are kind of talking past each other, and then they start making assumptions about each other's motives, and that creates this vicious cycle that erodes trust and erodes mutual understanding, and undermines our ability as communities to address our shared problems better. So what the CBD's been doing, what we're trying to do with deliberative journalism, is provide an alternative to that. How do we create conversations that don't reward those problematic tactics, right? That don't feed into the simple negative aspects of human nature that want those stories, and actually equips people to have the deeper conversation. And certainly in our events, we see that. We see people shifting their perspective. We see people. We have these beautiful aha moments that my students relate to me of someone like all of a sudden realizing the person that they're talking to is not evil, right? Or is not stupid, right? It's like, oh, now I see where you're coming from, right? They still might disagree. They certainly might like their argument more but they see that there's a reasonable person that disagrees with them. So that's what we're trying now to translate into the journalism, into these weekly conversations that we're helping the Coloradoan with, but also kind of building up, really, thinking about what's the role of a local newspaper in contributing to the local conversation, right? Some of those are traditional in terms of providing more good information and providing kind of access to a broad range of voices. But we're really kind of pushing on this third in terms of intervening in the conversation to help people have these broader ones, to reframe issues, to help us to dig into them in a much more productive way.
Big question. Is that actually leading to better decisions or to better decision making?
Yeah, I think certainly, my goal, again, I'm a communication professor. My goal is to spark much better conversations. But, the heart of the word deliberation, right? To deliberate means to have a conversation about what should we do, right? So you're deliberating about a choice. So certainly our assumption, and I think we certainly have evidence of this with different projects, that if you elevate the quality of the discussion, then the decisions are going to be better. Not only hopefully would the decision be better, but there's also more legitimacy to the decision. There's more support for it, right? People realize, if you go through a good process, so when the decision's made and then it goes to implementation of a new policy, there's actually more support for that long term.
So now to Eric Larsen, the editor of the Coloradoan. Why did his newspaper decide to join the project and embrace deliberative journalism?
We were looking for a way to move past a traditional opinion offering that, frankly, that we didn't have the staff to do anymore. I had, as our newsroom had retracted over the years, one thing that we found was we did have a full-time opinion editor and columnist. And as we looked at what was resonating with readers, that was one thing that wasn't. And so as we shifted some resources to reporting, we're a fairly small newsroom, we're 13 people now, and to cover a metro area with 360,000 people, there were just a lot of stories that we weren't getting to. And we felt that it was more important that we give people information than allow them to opine on things that we weren't telling them about in the first place. But, in retracting from that role, what we found was there was a real kind of vacuum of that, town hall sounding board that the lack of a opinion offering created. And so what we looked at was, how might we do things differently? Because we know that, as we try to grow, as we try to reach younger audience, and I'm not talking younger as in, 20-something-year-olds, I'm talking about people my age, who I'm in my early 40s, and many of my peers would never think to write a letter to the editor Many of my peers don't know what an op-ed is or an editorial or the difference of those things, but they do know conversation. They do know this Facebook-driven social media era where, conversation happens at the speed of life and not at the speed of print. So what we look to do is say, okay, how can we broaden our range of voices that are represented? Because typically, we had a weekly print opinion offering that was probably on one page. So you got maybe the voices of 3 people represented. And they were usually the same type of older white people who tend to write letters to the editor. And we said, well, how can we appeal to the more casual writer, the involved citizen who might not, want to sit down and write 250, even to 600 words about an issue, but really pointedly says, hey, I have this to say about this, and I want to say it somewhere that I'm not going to get immediately attacked at, because Facebook is just not a safe space for that in many places. And so there's a real interesting platform. It's called the Coral Project, that Gannett has been a part of, and we were able to use their commenting platform, which it takes out a lot of the very obvious initial incivility by moderating out vulgarities, by moderating out personal attacks, and letting them either just saying like, hey, a moderator has to approve these and whatnot, but we're going to have this conversation around it. And we thought of really the back end of it was, how do we create a little bit more balance in our opinion offering by saying like, hey, here's a question that we have that came off local news, and we invite all stripes, regardless of if you're a subscriber or not. We invite all stripes to come in and have their say and start that conversation there. And that was really kind of the genesis of what we call Coloradoan Conversations, which is our product of this. And so, every week we ask a question or two, and we hope that people engage in it. And then the bigger part of the deliberative journalism aspect of it is our partnership with Colorado State University's Center for Public Deliberation, where Martin Carcasson and his students, they'll go in and look through the conversation to look for value-based statements, different parts of deliberation, parts of good deliberation and parts of bad deliberation, to help us kind of frame the conversation. And ultimately our goal is to work toward community solutions with these, and whether it's just improving the amount of information that's available on, to decision makers, to say, a lot of issues that we have, distrust in media is also seen in distrust in our institutions. And a lot of that comes from, especially in the pandemic era, people feeling, not involved in the processes. So if we can say like, hey, here's a forum, there's an active growing group of people, who are interested in this, and we're going to present, not as a editorial, not as, we're saying this should happen, but this is the conversation around a given topic, and hopefully that leads to better decision makers by the people who we put in charge.
It sounds like a pretty simple idea, that you ask people to come in, send in their thoughts, their ideas, their comments on a big issue, and you sort of moderate it. But actually what you're saying is it's far more complicated than that. There's a lot of thought that goes into how you then present some of that information that's sent to you. So what does a final product sort of look like? Or what does the conversations look like once it's ready to go live?
Mm-hmm. I mean, it'll look different based on the conversation. Sometimes, sometimes we're looking at volume, like almost a simple vote. Here's we asked this and 70% of the people said, no, the city needs to go back to the drawing board on this, but then we look at, okay, why, what are the underlying factors that are driving those, and right now in Fort Collins, we have a big conversation about a land use code, which guides how the city, which is rapidly growing, will grow into the future, and people's concerns about how the code is presented would increase the potential for housing density in what once was called probably a large town and is now a small city, acting more like that. But the conversation, of course, is, does increasing density actually improve affordability in a place that is, that the median housing, the home price is more than $600,000, where a lot of, our working class has already been, in effect, priced out of home ownership. And so that's the place where we're starting to get to the point where it's not just a one-off, let's ask a question this week and answer one the next week, but where we're really trying to dig into the different facets of the tensions in these, in people's expectations about what a land use code might look like, and providing that, on a week-to-week basis. So each week, it's a recap of the conversation of what we're trying to do. But our ultimate goal in working with Martin and his students is to provide maybe some research guides, about, hey, here are the main conversations points presented about this 427-page document that we've produced, over, what will be, a span of months, that allow people to really dive into what something that they felt was inaccessible, right or wrong, through the city's initial processes that largely happened during, COVID shutdowns and hesitancy to, engage in these processes. So we're hoping that it serves kind of as an unofficial guide for people to speak on these issues, not just from the gut feeling of, yes, I want Fort Collins to grow, or no, I don't want Fort Collins to grow, but to really look at, like, this is how these documents would impact the future of the place that all of these people so care about and are passionate about. So try to get past just those initial passions and provide good, solid information about what these changes actually would mean.
Has it had any effect on how you do your day-to-day journalism? Is it making you think a little bit differently?
I think anytime that you're opening yourself up to additional feedback, critique, comments, it does, because the questions that we receive, the comments that we receive through this, definitely impact our reporting.
And how popular is this conversations forum? Is it sort of something you've been surprised by, how people are reacting to it?
I mean, it's I wouldn't say I was surprised. I didn't have expectations that this would be a large volume to start, but when we ask a question now, we can expect a solid conversation of 30 to 90 posts, people going back and forth, and maybe that might be there's probably a core group of 20 to 30 commenters who I kind of know by name and recognize, but there's additional people coming in based on the topic and conversation. I think it's been pretty well received. Metrics wise, they've performed better than our traditional opinion offering that we did in the past. We see more readership per post, more engagement around that. And then, and that gives us the runway to hopefully build it into the future.
And you mentioned something interesting before about trust or lack of trust. And everywhere around the world, there's quite a low level of trust in the media, particularly the US. I think only 34% of people overall trust the media to report fairly and accurately. Do you find is this project having any impact or making people come back to your paper, come back to sort of trust or engagement with you?
Hard to say. I mean, I think there are very involved, low trust readers who tend to skew conservative, but they're very engaged with us. I don't know that I'm going to win their trust, but I can show that yes, you have a place in the conversation. You are not being ignored. You are being added into the conversation that we're providing. And I mean, the underpinnings that undermine trust in the media, I mean, those will still be there for these people, but at the very least, at a low level, we're showing that no, you have a place in the conversation.
And by being so inclusive with all the different voices and opinions, do you think you're in a small way perhaps sort of tackling the problem of polarization, that you're showing that all voices are welcome and equally valued? Is that helping with that other big problem that everybody faces, which is
Yeah.
polarization?
Yeah, that's the hope. And that's the hope, is that, we can get beyond the loudest voices dominating, and show that, again, as most people, as I forget who said it, but there's the 80% of us who live in the middle, who are open to having our ways of thinking challenged, who are open to having dialogue, and to hear other views that, again, that's not as odd as it's made out to be on other platforms sometimes. That we can show that there's a place for discussion and consideration of other viewpoints and all of those. And so I think that it's not overt, but I think when you look at the conversation, and you can see two people who disagree on something start to just kind of get into it, and but say, okay, I see your point, but have you thought about this? And if they're going back and forth and having that respectful dialogue, that's a win for us, over what we were previously doing, which I would always call ping pong opinion, which is like, oh, we present one opinion here, and then we wait a week and we present one opinion here, and it's just, and we expect that readers are actually following along, when the fact of the matter is most of them aren't. So if we can capture that balance, that full-fledged conversation in one capsule, I think it allows people to see that, yeah, I mean, there are some good arguments out there that might challenge my way of thinking and might bring me closer to the middle, on some of these topics.
You mentioned a word quite earlier on in this discussion, diversity. Has this sort of opened the door for more voices and actually increased diversity in your offering and how you're engaging with people?
That's the hope. I don't know that that we're there yet, really. I think Fort Collins is a lot more diverse than it used to be, even in the 10 years that I've grown here. But I mean, we are largely a monoculture, still, and I think getting underrepresented voices into those conversations has been and will be a bigger lift, and what it doesn't just involve us providing the platform, but it involves us having more outreach, into those community groups, and frankly, not doing it in a way that the media has done it in the past where, we always go into underrepresented community groups and say, what do you think about this? Like, what can you tell us about these things? What can you give us? And it often feels like a very disingenuous effort.
I've got a lot of questions talking about the problems you're facing, because there are so many problems the media faces. Another one particularly for you is that there's a huge problem with local media surviving in the current economic and business models, and particularly newspapers are closing at, I think, 2 a week, a rate of 2 a week in America, or have been. That really, that there's a vanishing local voice for many, many communities, and they call it, a desert. Do you see sort of deliberative journalism as sort of one of the tools that could kind of re-engage communities and keep local media relevant to their audiences?
Absolutely. I think, a news outlet that doesn't speak with its community, that instead just speaks to its community is probably going to have a lot of issue surviving going forward.
So is deliberative journalism here to stay for you?
I hope so. I hope that we have the bandwidth and the manpower to continue to produce it. That, if we have those decisions, we can always create deliberative opportunities that are news-based and not, necessarily production-based. Maybe we don't do them on a week-to-week basis, but maybe we do them around, as part of the toolbox in our coverage of big, events. So, I mean, I really hope so. I think there's a lot of opportunity in it going forward for people who are just willing to engage and embrace some of the the uncertainty that comes with it.
Back to Martin Carcasson from the Center for Public Deliberation. How does he see the future for both deliberative communication and journalism? And just how much interest is there in adopting the concepts?
And again, I'll make the split between kind of the deliberative work and the deliberative journalism work. Certainly the deliberative work, the CPD has replicated itself. There's very similar organizations and lots of different universities. I did a lot of work. The Kettering Foundation, which is a really hub for this work in the United States. I was part of for 10 years, part of the Centers for Public Life program, training people to start centers like this, right? And we probably had 80 or 100 or so communities kind of go through that process. And organizations like the National Coalition for Dialogue and Deliberation and the Bridge Alliance, there's a lot of, and a lot of these have grown in the last 15, 20 years of these resources to get beyond kind of two-party, get beyond polarization, and build resources to bring people together. So then applying it specifically to journalism, certainly kind of still pretty new. Working some with the American Press Institute, we've had some work. The Kettering Foundation and they have a program officer focused on journalism. So we've had some meetings to kind of spread this, right? And part of we're trying to figure it out here first. Once we start really figuring it out, then my goal is to build some toolkits, to do some trainings, to do some workshops, to provide kind of journalists that are interested on how to do this. Following, we work a lot with or aware of like the solutions journalism movement. There's some really interesting connections between solutions journalism and deliberative journalism, and some differences, right? But they provide this model of they built this new way of doing journalism, and then they're training and they're creating a network of solutions journalists, which we're really excited about what they're doing, and we see it as a very positive thing. We have a little bit of a different kind of toolkit, but a complementary one, but we see kind of what they're doing is in some ways kind of showing us the path that we might be doing. And our work is both. We try to engage with both active journalists and also journalism educators, right? So we got quite a few journalism professors in different places that are part of this conversation that are kind of watching what we're doing, and hopefully, as we work with a journalism professor here that has a dedicated class, experimenting, we'll present at conferences and so forth about what we're doing, and hopefully kind of grow it.
So you're pretty confident deliberative journalism might take off in some form?
I think so. I mean, again, I think it's a win-win. I think it's communities need it, and I think a lot of local papers and news outlets need to kind of redefine themselves and kind of make it clear their value to a community. So I do think it is kind of a potential win-win there, hopefully moving forward.
Thank you to my guest, Martin Carcasson, the director of the Center for Public Deliberation at Colorado State University, and Eric Larsen, the editor of the Coloradoan newspaper. Thank you for joining me, Tanya Sakzewski, for this Mediadelcom podcast produced by Media Diversity Institute Global. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please like and share it. We look forward to your company next time. Goodbye.